All right, it looks like we're live on Facebook and then also on Zoom. So for those of you that missed it on Facebook, I'm Nirpam from the Underwater Photography Guide and Blue Water Photo. All right, so remember last class we were in the develop module of Lightroom. I mean, in the library module of Lightroom. This is the library module where you can see all of your photos. Remember that Lightroom is actually split up into basically 4 different panels. On the right side, you have your editing panel where you make all your edits. On the left side, you have your organizational panel where you can see your folders and your photos. And on the bottom, you can see the photos in the folder that you're working on. So that's kind of how Lightroom is structured. And you should always think of Lightroom as being your editing section is on the right and your organization section is on the left, and on the bottom you can view everything. Now this is Lightroom 11, so I'm going to be showing features that are in Lightroom 11, which is the most updated version of Lightroom. Lightroom 11 is a game changer. There are features that are just incredible that previous versions of Lightroom have not had. So I do highly recommend I do highly recommend upgrading if you haven't, even if you have Lightroom 5 or a version that you paid for that you don't want to upgrade because you want to keep that license. I still recommend upgrading because there are 2 tools in particular that we'll go over, which are masking tools where you can actually select the subject, and they are very useful. So without further ado, I will go into the develop module. And actually, before I do that, why don't we go ahead and pick some of the photos that I'm going to edit over the course of the class. And I do have specific photos in mind. These photos are from my last underwater photo workshop to Socorro. And there are specific photos that I think would show you the best ways to edit underwater photos and are common examples of how to edit underwater photos. So I'm going to go ahead and pick this one. And the way I picked it is I selected P on my keyboard, which flags that as a pick. And this is in my day 1 of my Socorro photos on the folder on the left, as you can see. And I know I've got a good eel somewhere down here, I hope. And that one I know is a little bit trickier to edit, especially with the colors. So I want to select that photo. It's just going to take me a second to find it. Normally, I would have gone through my photos and found the ones that I wanted to delete. Okay, I'm going to pick, I do know I want this whale. So I'm going to go ahead and pick this one. So again, I flagged that as a pick by pressing P. That was a tough one to edit. I'm also going to pick this one. And I do want to pick a couple of sharks. So let's go up to the sharks. I'm going to pick that one. I'll pick this one. And this just gives me a series of photos that I can edit. Perfect. All right. Now I'm just looking for that one eel photo, which I remember that I wanted to find. Okay, that's okay. So now to sort all your picked photos, all you have to do is go to the attribute section in the library. So I'm in the grid view of the library. To get to your grid view, press G, and then in the library, I can go to attributes, and now I can click flagged. And these are all my flagged photos that I've flagged to edit. So what I actually want to do here is I have a folder that I called edited photos, and I'm going to go to all of these flagged photos. I'm going to select all of them by clicking Control A. And then I'm going to drag them over. Oops. All right, and then I'm going to drag them over to the edited photos folder. And this will physically move the files on your hard drive as well. So your photos will move from the pic section over to the folder in your hard drive. And again, this is all review from the last course. So you can review it in the last course. But now I have my edited photos or the photos that I want to edit. So notice here that some of these photos are already edited, like this one. I can actually reset my edits if I don't like that. So the way you start editing photos is you go into the develop module. That's where you edit photos. And now I can click reset on the bottom right here. And that will bring you back to the original photo. And I think I have some, yeah. So now we have a bunch of unedited photos that I've captured. So with that, I kind of want to walk through the basics of editing with a fairly easy photo to edit. And we're going to be going through every one of these sections in the develop module right here on the right. So you can actually collapse and spread out the sections with these arrows on the right side. And each section deals with a different aspect of the photo. So the nice thing about Lightroom is it's pretty well organized. When you want to start editing a photo, and the photo that I'm going to choose is, I think I'm going to do this one right here. When you want to start editing a photo, you basically start with the top and you go down. So you start with your basic edits, then you can look at your tone curves, color, or HSL, details, lens corrections. And some of these I actually don't use, and we'll get to which ones I use and which ones I don't use. Some of them are more for video editing, or they work better for topside photos. But again, this is all a class with an underwater perspective. So before I start making edits, notice on the left side here, instead of having the folders where you can see your photos, it has different modules. And what you have is your history, which shows you what edits you've made, as well as a few presets right here. I don't usually recommend doing any presets, but if you ever want to get artsy or just want a quick place to start, you can actually create your own Lightroom presets, or you can use the Lightroom presets right here on the left. So this would apply. Oh, okay, here we go. So this applies presets right here, but I don't really want to use any of those. And you can see in the history, all the presets that I clicked have been recorded. So if at any point you want to go back to where you've been editing, you can actually go back in your history and click where you were, and I can actually go right back to the beginning. Or, like I said, if I have this preset that I accidentally clicked and I didn't like it, I can go to the bottom right of my develop bar on the right and click reset, and that'll bring me back to the beginning. So let's start with this basic module, and I'll talk a little bit about exposure and color correction. So the first thing that I like to do is tell Lightroom what part of my photo is white. And that's what a white balance is. So white balance is basically the overall tone and temperature and tint of your photo. So the best way to measure that is by taking a neutral color like white, gray, or black and telling Lightroom this is white, gray, or black. So the way you do that is you have this little dropper tool right here in the basics module, and you click on the dropper tool, and then you can click on a white, gray, or black part of your image. So I went ahead and I clicked this, and if you can see that the shark, because sharks and pelagic critters tend to be gray, black and white, they tend to be really good subjects for getting white balance correct in your photos. Now notice that this rock structure right here doesn't really look like an appropriate color. It looks a little bit magenta. It looks a little bit red. The reason for that is because the strobes actually lit up my shark in the background rather than the foreground. So the most accurate color in your photo is actually going to be where your strobes light up. And it's really important to remember that. So instead of actually in this photo, clicking on the shark, it would be better if I found a white part of this part of the image where the strobe actually lit it up. And this looks like it could have been white at some point. And now you've got a little bit more of an accurate color. In this case, I would say the color is not quite to where I want it. So what I can do now is I can actually do manual adjustments of white balance with the temperature and tint tools. And all white balance is temperature and tint. So you can either go, from blue to yellow, or you can go from green to magenta. And that's the general temperature and tint of the image that you're adjusting. It's just green, magenta, blue, and yellow. So in this case, the image looks a little bit magenta, so I can move my image a little bit more towards green. And that evens out the color just a tad. I like water to look a little bit bluer, so sometimes I move my temperature just a little bit towards blue. So anytime you make an adjustment in Lightroom and you're adjusting these bars right here, when you're doing those adjustments, if you ever want to go back, all you have to do is hit Control on your keyboard or Command on your keyboard if you're using a Mac, and then Z, and that brings you right back to the beginning. So that's what I do if I ever made a mistake and I don't like the edit I made. I do Command or Control and then I hit Z. Another thing that you can do is you can actually double click on the word exposure or highlights or whatever control that you moved. You can double click on that control and it goes right back to 0. So that's kind of a cool way to get back to where you were without having to go back into the history here. But as you can see, if I did want to go back into my history and look at a specific edit, I can do that and I can actually start over from that point. And it starts me back from that point. So I'm going to go ahead and do that quick correction. Again, that didn't really work. So I'm going to go back down here and that looks like white. It's a little bit magenta, so I'm going to move that towards green. So that's kind of how I mess with my initial colors. There's a lot more that goes into color editing, which we'll get to in these lower modules down here. But the first thing I like to do is just set the baseline color. All right, no questions yet. So the next thing I want to talk about is exposure. Exposure is basically the brightness of your image, how bright your image is, how bright different aspects of your image are. And the best way to know how your image is exposed is to look at this little tool in the top right. So this tool is called a histogram. And a histogram will show you your color channels and how exposed they are. So how dark or how light they are. The lighter your image gets, the more to the right the histogram goes. The darker your image gets, the more to the left your histogram goes. And you can see you've got this big pinnacle right here. So one of the cool things about histograms is that you don't really have to care, where your histogram is in the image. There's going to be certain parts of your image that are light and that are dark. It's just a tool to tell you where you've lost data. So what that means is at some point, there can be a point where if your image is too bright, there's literally nothing here. I mean, you can see there's no details, there's no nothing. If you start out with a photo like that, there's no way to get those details back. And that's important to know. What the histogram will tell you is if there's a big peak on the left or the right, there's a loss of detail. Now, Lightroom has a specific tool that allows you to see where you've lost your detail. And that tool are these two arrows right here. So if you click on this arrow right here on the left, on the right side of the histogram, this will tell you where you've clipped your highlights. And so that's called clipping, where you've lost that data. So this tells me if this was the image I started with, I would have lost data on the shark. I would have lost it in the water right here. So I probably wouldn't go with this photo. But thankfully, my exposure is all the way up. So if I bring my exposure back down, you can see I haven't lost any details from my highlights. But it is a dark image. So what about my shadows? On the left side, you've got your shadows. Now you can also see I haven't lost anything in my shadows, but if I brought the exposure down, then I lost detail in my shadows. So that's how you know if you've got an image you can work with or you can't. One good example in this series of images that I selected is this photo right here. I can tell that this is blown out, that there's a loss of detail. So if I click this triangle, now you can see I've lost detail in my highlights. And we'll see if we can bring those back or not. So going back to the photo that we were working with, I can go ahead and edit my highlights or my shadows or my blacks or my whites. And you can see the adjustments that are made on this histogram as I do that. Now, what I usually do when I start with my exposure is I'll start with my shadows and I bring those up just a tad. And I'll bring the blacks up as well a little bit. And then I'll drop my highlights if I need to in my whites. Now, that might seem counterintuitive. Why would you bring your highlights down? Why would you make them darker and your shadows up? It's just making the image flat, right? Because you won't have that much contrast. Well, I kind of think of it as a raw file in a lot of ways. And I sometimes find that if you even out your image just a little bit and then you add contrast afterwards, you get this nice, even looking contrast. You get nice colors. But again, that's not a rule by any means. It's just how I typically start with my photos, and that's my personal preference. But of course, I'll make adjustments as I need to. So I like the water coming, I like the light going through the water here, so I'll increase my highlights and bring that light coming out. And again, this shark, it looks a little bit blue for me. So I'm actually going to increase the color temperature a little bit towards yellow. And the reason I'm doing that is because I'm going to crop this photo and I'm actually going to focus on the shark. I don't like all this stuff I have in the foreground. So before I do that, all I'm doing is I'm just trying to measure up the exposure. Now, these tools right here are dangerous tools. They're very effective, but they're overused. What these tools do are they increase or decrease the midtone contrast in your image. They make things look clearer. So the clarity tool is probably the tool I use the most. Adding a little bit of clarity just makes your photo pop. But you can see if you add too much, it makes it look a little bit black, a little bit weird, kind of grungy. Same with dehaze. Dehaze will make your photo pop, but what it does also is it makes your photo darker and it changes the color temperature. So dehaze is an even harder tool to work with. I typically use dehaze on photos where it seems like it's a cloudy day, or I mean, the function is in the name. So that's when I use dehaze. But I'll do just a tiny bit of dehaze, tiny bit of clarity, and then I'll often have to bring my blacks and my shadows up because that's what gets crushed when you increase your clarity and your dehaze. They get darker. Another thing that happens when you increase your clarity and your dehaze is you actually get noise in the image. So noise is these little dots that you see, and this isn't a great example of a photo where you can see noise. So let's go ahead and get to this photo right here. If I bring up my exposure, this is a whale that I shot, and I increase my clarity, you can see the whale pops out a lot more, but you get a lot more grain. And that's one of the hard things about using midtone contrast. You end up getting more grain. So that's something to keep in mind. So I use it sparingly, and I'm going to go ahead and reset this photo because we'll get to it. So going back to this photo that we started with, I think this is way too much clarity. That's way too much dehaze. And in fact, this is a pretty dark photo. So let me go ahead and try to edit this the way that I would want to see this photo. Okay, I'm actually not a big fan right now, but there are some tricks that I can use later on to really make that shark pop. So what I'm going to do now is I really want to focus on the actual aspect of the image that I want to edit. And the way you do that is you crop the image. So the cropping tool is in the specialized toolbar right here. There's a few other tools that we'll get to, but cropping is usually the only one that I start in the beginning. The next one is backscatter removal, or the spot removal tool. And then you have your mask overlay, which is something that I will work with depending on when I need it. But for the sake of demonstration, I'm going to do it at the end because it's one of the more complicated tools. So I'm going to go ahead and click crop. And now you have this cropping tool right here. What I think this image would do well with is a vertical crop. So what I'm actually going to do to get a vertical crop is I'm going to bring the corner of the image in, and then I move my cursor down. And it takes a little bit of practice to get used to that feeling. And if you guys don't edit with a mouse, I highly recommend having a mouse, because that's how you can really focus on where your crops are going. So, and it's just a good way to like really finesse your any adjustments that you're making in general as well. So I like this crop, but there's one thing that I want to do to make it even better. You can actually angle your crops, and the way you do that is you click on the outside of the image, you hold it down, you hold your mouse down, and then you move left or right, and that allows you to angle the crop. So I'm going to go ahead and angle this crop just a little bit. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get the sun to appear really prominent in the photo with just a little bit of substrate and the shark. And often when I'm cropping, I consider the rule of thirds. You know, is this image separated into thirds? And then I also consider, where is the focus of the subject? I like to leave a little bit of space in front of the subject, like I do here, so that it has room to move. And this isn't a great example of that, just because I don't really like where the subject's going, and I want to get the sun in here, so they're working against each other. But I try to find space in front of the subject, and then finally, I'll try to have the four corners around the center box of the grid hit over the eye of the subject. And that's what I'm doing right now. So I'm going to go ahead and click crop, done, on the bottom right. And that gives me a crop. And I think this is an okay crop. Like I'm happy with it. It's an all right, it's an okay image. Would I keep this image personally at the end of all this? No. But I just wanted to start with a random image, because I find that if I try to set up an image that I like, there's less edits that I need to do. So I do have one question. Do you crop based on the type and size of photo you want to print? So yeah, that's a great question. You can crop any way you want. And I personally have this preference for cropping within the aspect ratio of the camera that I was using. But lots of people like to use different aspect ratios. You know, if you have a different project, you might need a different aspect ratio. So the way you can adjust your aspect ratio is pretty simple. It's right under aspect right here. And you click, I'm in original, but you click this button on the right side, and you can choose your aspect ratio. So let's say that a 4:3 would actually work better here, which I think it would. I think a 4:3 is kind of more for Micro Four Thirds cameras, but I think it gives me a little bit more room in front of the shark. And now my grid line is kind of towards its eye. So I actually like 4:3 better on this one. So let's do 4:3 for the sake of demonstration. Now, if you do want your original crop, just remember, sometimes you need to actually go back in and hit original. It doesn't always keep an original crop. And if you want to do your own crop, you go to the drop down, and then you click custom. And this will allow you to stay on original. Oh, sometimes you have to make sure this lock button is unlocked so that you can actually do it. So now I can do a custom crop. And actually, let's do a custom crop for the sake of an example, because I think a custom crop could be really interesting when it comes to this photo. So I really love, I think a wide perspective would be really interesting here. So let's try that. I can see this working. It's not my favorite, but I think this is kind of a cool crop. So let's start with this. This is a custom crop that we're going to do. So that was a good question. Thanks, Gary. yeah, so now I've got a custom crop. I still have the sun. I've got a little bit of substrate. I'm thinking about the rule of thirds. I've got a third here, and then the substrate's not quite a third, but it kind of looks like it. And I tried to create lines that were diagonal, and now you have space in front of the subject. So this is an interesting crop. I don't usually, like I said, do custom crops. I usually like original crops, but this will work. One other thing I want to show you about the crop tool is if you hit the crop tool and then you go to angle, you can move your angle back to neutral by double clicking angle, and that brings you back to where you were. Now I'm not going to do that. I like the crop as it is, so I just did Control Z to go back. All right, so now I've made a crop. From here, I'm going to talk a little bit about the tone curve, which is this next module, but I actually don't use this tool a lot. The reason I don't use it is because I find it works better for working with human skin tones and working with topside photos, not so much underwater photos. But what the tone curve is it's another way to look at exposure. So it's another way to look and see, where are the shadows and the blacks in the image, where are the highlights and the whites. And the way it does that is it creates a histogram for you, and you can edit different color channels of your image based on this histogram. So it starts out with white, as you can see here, and it gives you a curve right here. Right now it's a straight line, which means there's no edits. But remember, on the histogram, the right side of the histogram are your highlights, and the left side are your shadows. So what you can actually do is increase or lower your exposure by going up and down on the tone curve, and you can adjust those aspects of the image. And often, if you want to add a little more contrast, sometimes an S-shaped curve is a common thing to do. So that's bringing your shadows down and your highlights up. I personally don't like this at all, and I think it makes your image look kind of weird, but that's something that you can do. If you want to reset it, you just double click on that line, and now you're back to where you were. Again, you can edit different color channels of your image. So now you've got your blues, and you can actually change the color temperature of those colors. I prefer the HSL tools. So I did talk about tone curves, but again, I don't really use them. I think when you're just starting out in Lightroom, you don't really need them. And if you're already an advanced editor, now you know how to play with them. So you can play with them as much as you want and see if they work for you. For me, I feel like a mix of the HSL tools and then the masking tools, which we'll talk about next, are a lot more useful. So let me just check Facebook real quick and see if we have any questions. Oh, I do have some people that are having trouble finding the live chat, so I'm going to just go ahead and respond to them real quick. So just give me one quick second. And let's make sure that we don't have any other people that are trying to join. Cool. Okay. All right. So let's move on to color editing. So down here is your HSL and color tool. So I'm going to expand that. Now, HSL stands for hue, saturation, and luminance. And what this tool allows you to do is it allows you to select certain colors and edit them in different ways. So your hue tool allows you to change the actual color depending on where it is on the rainbow spectrum. So for example, if you have green in your photo, you can actually move your greens and turn them to blue, or you can turn them yellow, because those are the two colors on either side of green. Your saturation tool allows you to increase the amount of that color, to increase the saturation of that color. So you can specifically increase the saturation of your blues, and often that works really nicely when it comes to looking at your blues. Now, luminance is the brightness tool that allows you to change the brightness of a color. So you can make your blues darker or lighter, and that can be really useful for editing backgrounds. So in this case, I think my colors are a little bit off, and I think this tool will be pretty useful. So if I go to my hues, I notice that my aquas are pretty apparent here. And I might want to try to bring the shark out a little better by editing my aquas. So what I'm going to do is increase my, or move my aquas under the hue section towards blue. And I find that that often takes away that kind of annoying look you get from the aquas. And it's very subtle, but you can see if I do Control Z, there's my aquas before, and there it is after. Now, one of the cool things that you can do is you can actually take a look at your before and after when you're working with an image by going to the bottom left here into your toolbar, and you can click not reference view, X and Y, or Y and Y. And this gives you your before and your after the image. So this is the image we're working in, and this is the before image. So again, that's right in your toolbar right here where it says YY. And if you keep clicking, it'll show you different splits of your image so you can really get a feel for where your colors, how you're adjusting it. And then just to go back to where you were, you go to loop view, which is also the D on your keyboard. All right, so back to the colors. I'm going to also decrease the saturation of the aquas in order to get the white to pop out a little bit more. I don't think this image really needs aquas in it, but I will increase the saturation of the blues. And one of my favorite things that I like to do in blue water photos is I actually like to move the hue of the blue a little bit towards purple, just to make that blue look really deep, just to give it a deep color. So I'm going to increase the saturation of blue and then make it a little bit deeper, and that gives that a really dramatic tone and look. And now finally, luminance. My blue color channel is really the only one that I really care about in this photo, but at the same time, I don't think it's super necessary to edit the luminance of the blue color channel in this case. If you ever want to, you can kind of make adjustments of different colors though and how bright they are. In this photo, I don't think it's very useful. Your aquas though, the aquas here, I kind of do think I could increase the exposure just a tad, just to create a little bit of contrast in the water right here. And those red dots, remember that's from the histogram. So I'm going to go ahead and click that so I don't have that in my photo anymore. So this photo really required only minor adjustments to the colors. I will work on a photo next that will require major adjustments, which is this whale photo in the bottom right here. And I'm going to try to get that to where I got it before. But this is a good overview of using your hues, saturation, and luminance. Yeah, I'm just making that a little bit deeper, moving that a little bit towards purple. But you don't want to make it too purple. Sometimes I get a little bit too much color, so I'll get too much purple, too much red. And you can actually decrease your reds and your purples in terms of their saturation. And sometimes that just gives you a little bit cleaner of a blue, but also in the substrate, remember I didn't like that magenta color. So now I can actually take it out and the substrate looks a little bit more gray than when we first started. So if I do that comparison again, you can see the substrate colors change just a tad. All right, let's see if we have any other. Okay, and then I'm just going to clarify for the people that can't find the class. Okay, cool. All right, so now I've done some basic edits with colors, and I'm gonna keep going down. Color grading, this is a tool right here that is used for video editing. So I usually don't recommend using the color grading tools to edit your colors, but if you do have some video clips, you can do minor edits with color grading. And what it does is it allows you to change the color temperatures of different exposure channels. So your highlights or your shadows or your blacks or midtones, you can change the actual color temperature that way of each section of your image. But again, I think your color tools are enough, and your basic white balance correction tools should be enough, and your filters, your masking tools should be enough. So this is something I only really recommend for video. I have one more question. How do you get rid of your last edit or your last 3 edits? So again, this kind of goes back to the history channel or the history bar on the left side. So again, this is your organizational bar. If you go into your history and you don't like an edit, all you have to do is go to the last 3 edits. You can count them down, or you get a preview on the top box right here, on the top photo above the history bar. That'll show you what that edit was or what that recent edit was, and you can see that preview is changing as I scroll up and down the history. So I would use a history to go back in time to get your last edits. So now we can edit our details, and this is something that I actually typically like to edit right after I do my clarity and dehaze tools, because remember, we have a lot of noise in the image. And in this case, I think our details are looking okay. I wouldn't say that it's too noisy, but we can get rid of noise. And the way you get rid of noise is you go to your luminance tool and you increase your noise reduction. And I do this very sparingly. The reason I do it sparingly is because that grain will disappear as you increase your noise reduction, but you'll also lose detail. So I moved my sharpening all the way up. Here's my luminance. So if I move my luminance all the way up, you can see maybe right over here, there's a loss of detail. It's a little subtle. Look at the bubbles. But if I move the luminance all the way up, I've lost that detail. And I don't want to lose detail. So one of the cool things you can do is you can, increase your noise reduction. You can increase that luminance bar, but then you can add detail back to the areas that you want to keep. So the way you do that is with sharpening. So what I'll do is I'll do a balance of luminance and sharpening. So I'll increase my luminance a little bit so that I have less noise. And then I'll go back out in the image and I'll go to my sharpening tool right above it. And this box right here gives you a nice little preview of the details. So you can move that around. Let me move that to the shark. And now I'm going to sharpen up the shark a little bit because I don't want that to lose detail. And the way I do that is I hold the Alt key on the keyboard, and then I click the masking tool and I increase this. And the masking tool allows you to apply sharpening to different parts of your subject as you increase that mask. And I just want the shark, and sure, maybe I'll have a little bit of that sun that's behind the shark. So I increased my masking tool. And now I'm going to add a little bit of sharpness. Just a tad. I increase everything a little bit of the radius, the detail. You don't want to go too overboard with sharpness or it'll look kind of grainy and grungy. But this can be just a nice way to add a little bit of that sharpness that I lost. So that's how you work with details. And we'll get into some really crazy detail editing pretty soon here with this whale photo. Let's see if I have any questions about details. And I'm just going to check. Perfect. All right. So now we can talk about lens corrections. So lens corrections are a pretty incredible tool that can be used incorrectly very easily. So lens corrections allow you to correct for different properties of your lens, of the image, but they also allow you to add distortion and vignetting. And these are tools that I think can be overdone, but they can also be very useful. So going to this profile section right here, the profile will basically, if you click enable profile corrections, this will allow your Lightroom to find the lens that you were using and apply a correction based on that lens. Now, in this case, I was actually using an adapter for a Canon lens on a Sony camera, so it had a lot of trouble finding that. And for those of you that are wondering where Olympus is, Olympus already applies those corrections, I believe. So, but it can be an interesting tool. Let me get out of this photo for a second, back to the library. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to this photo, which I'm going to reset. This was an edit that I did previously as an example. And I'm going to do a quick exposure edit so you guys can see the island here. And now I'll go to my lens corrections. And if I click enable profile corrections, you can see there's a very subtle change, but Lightroom is adding distortion and it's adding exposure corrections based on the optical properties of your lens. And it found my lens. It's a Sony 16 to 35 millimeter f4. So it can be useful or it cannot be useful. I personally don't like profile corrections. I like the look that a lens gives a photo. I think it looks more real. I think this kind of just flattens it out and makes it look weird. But if you have an ultra wide lens, sometimes it can help to do a profile correction or not. So that's one way to, edit your distortion and vignetting in the photo based on the lens itself. And it can be a useful tool. It's less useful, in my opinion, underwater. So I typically don't select it, but it's good to know that it's there. Now going back to the photo. One thing that I always select is remove chromatic aberration. Now, chromatic aberration is a fringing that you tend to get on really high contrast photos. And that fringing can actually happen where you get a lot of dark and light in the same spot. So sometimes it happens up here in the top of the photo where you might have the sun coming through, or it can happen where you might have some strobe lighting. It's on modern cameras, it's a lot less common, so you don't see it as much. There's a little tiny bit of fringing right up at the nose of the shark, but again, it's very hard to find a photo that actually has chromatic aberration. That being said, I always select this, and I select this upon my import when I actually import the photo into Lightroom. If you don't remember how to do that, that's in my organizational talk that I gave last week, and you can scroll down under the newsfeed and see that. But I'll just always hit remove chromatic aberration. And it might have had a tiny effect here. It's kind of hard to tell. Yeah, I can see it actually. For those of you that have a good eye, if you take a look at the fringing, it looks like magenta on the white of the sun coming through. That will be removed just slightly when I select that. It's very, very subtle. So I always select that. But what's most useful in your blends corrections is this manual distortion tool. And it can be useful, but you really don't want to overdo it. What distortion allows you to do is it allows you to distort the photo so that you can make it look more or less fisheye. And beyond going into a fisheye look with barrel distortion, you can actually make it look so you're closer to the subject. So for example, if I lower my distortion here, now I'm very close to the shark. And in fact, maybe I want to change my aspect ratio because I made it more distorted. So let's try 4:3. Oh, actually, I might want to just go back to my original. No. Again, you just kind of play around with things and see if you like it. So I actually don't like what the distortion does in this photo, but I can go the opposite way and I can take away some of that barrel distortion. Now notice you get these white parts of the image. What's going on is the photo is actually distorting outside of the image, but this can be a great way to do a crop. So maybe my image is going to look a lot cooler if I take away some of the distortion that, or if I add a little bit of the opposite of barrel distortion. I always forget what it's called. So it looks okay here. Again, I think I like where the image was to begin with. So I'm going to go ahead and just go back to where it was. But just distortion can be useful. The way that it can be especially useful is I'm going to go ahead and change the crop again. Is if you're not close enough to a subject. So I think one good example could be here, where I'm not really super close to the subject. So I can go ahead and go to my distortion tool. And now it's just a little bit closer to me. It's more of a fisheye look. And when I edited this photo, I actually took this tail out. So I'm going to show you guys how to take a tail out towards the end of this. So I do have one question. What keystrokes am I using to zoom in and out on a photo? That's a good question. I'm actually using my mouse. So I just click the photo in and out, and that'll do the trick. Feels like my computer's having a little bit of trouble loading this photo. And I think that might just be trying to live stream and zoom at the same time. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and, oh, I have one more question. Yeah, you can also do control and then scroll, or control plus or control minus to zoom in and out as well. How many undos can you do in an edit? You can really go as far as you want, as far as I know. It'll just keep taking you back down your history. Okay, I am going to move on to this photo because that one is having trouble loading. So I'm going to go ahead and do a quick edit and bring us back to where we were. Actually, no, I'm not going to do a quick edit. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you guys how to take an edit from one place and bring it to another. This I wanted to originally do later during the talk, but we can do this now because you can see this photo is having trouble loading. If you click Control Shift Escape, you can see that my memory is just getting kind of full, and it's having a little bit of trouble keeping up with live streaming. So now the way I can copy my edits from here to this photo is all you have to go and do is click on the photo that you want to copy. Oh, and then you click copy. And this gives you an option of what you want to copy and move over to the next photo. Generally, I leave it in default, but and default basically will allow you to copy global edits. So those are edits that edit the whole photo to the next photo. I don't try to copy non-global edits or edits that you do to just a certain part of the image because the subjects aren't going to line up. But what I'm going to go ahead and do is, let's see. So we've got our basic corrections that we did, tone curves, HSL, color grading. All of these things are okay. What I'm making sure that isn't selected is transform, crop, spot removal, masking. Those are all very specific edits to specific parts of the image. So again, you click copy on the bottom left here, then you can click copy. That copies your edits, and I'm going to move on to the photo, and we'll just edit this photo for now. And I'm going to click paste. Again, paste is on the bottom left right here. And then I'm going to do quick crop. I think Lightroom's having trouble rendering. So I'm going to go ahead and restart Lightroom real quick. And then I'm going to go back into Lightroom. And I'm going to share my screen again. Oh. Oh, okay. So yeah, my Lightroom crashed. And this is actually a good thing to show you guys. So I'm going to share my screen. My catalog file is over here, Lightroom class, and all right, I can actually open up Lightroom from the catalog file, and now I can go back to where we were. All right, so back to the photo. Now you can see this photo looks properly loaded, and because the edits, because the photo is so similar to this one over here, this other shark photo, the edits actually worked really nicely, and it just translated really nicely to this photo. But if I took these edits and I went ahead and copied them. If I copied them and then I moved them over to a photo that was completely different, and I pasted them, your edits aren't going to look quite so good. So the copy paste tool is super useful, but it's super useful for images that are very similar to each other. Now you can see the highlights are a little bit bright, so I'm going to just draw my highlights. And that's all I really needed to do. So that was a really nice transition, and I'm pretty happy about that. So let's go back to where we were. So we've done our lens corrections. Oh, but again, the lens corrections didn't copy over. I didn't want them to do that. So I'm going to click remove chromatic aberration. Transform, I don't really use this tool. So yeah, effects, I also don't really use that tool. Calibration, I also don't really use that tool. So that's kind of your basic editing tools under the develop section. But now we're going to go from our global edits, the edits of the whole image, to very specific edits, edits that are non-global. The tools for that are right here in this toolbar right here. And you've got your spot removal tool, which I use quite often, your red eye removal tool, which you probably are never going to use unless for some reason you're still shooting digital, or is it digital or just, I mean, sorry, film, or yeah, unless you're shooting film. And then your masking tools, which are the most powerful tools in Lightroom. So we're going to save the best for last, the masking for last. Let's go ahead and do a few edits to remove backscatter. Now you can see this photo doesn't have too much backscatter. So let's see if this older photo will load. I mean, this photo we were working on. Okay, here we go. So this did load, and this photo does have a lot more backscatter. So you can see having a little bit of trouble with my tools on this photo. I'm going to go ahead and go back to this one. Okay. All right, here we go. So if I want to remove this backscatter right here, the easiest way to do so, if you don't have a lot of it, is to click your spot removal tool. Oh, I have one question. What is the best way to define backscatter? That's a really good question. So backscatter, for those of you that are newer underwater photographers, backscatter are all these spots that you get in your photo. And the way these spots occur is if you have a strobe or you have a flash that bounces off particles in the water that are in front of your lens. And backscatter can be anything from like this large particle right here that you can see here. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. This large particle that you can see here to these really small particles. And there's different ways to get rid of the small particles versus the large particles. Often having a filter is a great way to get rid of them. So I'll get into masking tools and using that to remove backscatter. But generally, the easiest way to define backscatter is to just look at your spot heal tool. So this tool right here is your spot removal tool. And the way you can remove backscatter using it is if you go back to your image and you click heal, I always use heal to remove backscatter. Clone will make a lot of little spots in your photos and it won't look so nice. But if you go to heal, then you can go to the bottom of your toolbar after you click the spot removal tool, and you can click visualize spots. And this will give you a really good idea of where the backscatter is in your image. It's all these spots. And you can adjust the size of your tool with the size bar right here. And I try to get it really small, pretty accurate to where the spots are. And feather, I usually keep at 0 and opacity at 100. And what you do is you basically spend the next few days of your life just clicking dots and removing backscatter. And that's how you remove backscatter. It'll basically identify a location where it takes an average, and it'll replace the pixels where the original spot was with an average of the location it chooses. Now, if it chooses the wrong location, like let's say here, I'm going to go ahead and just do a big thing. And let's say it chose the shark. Now you might end up with a photo that looks like it's got this, yeah, this shark's not where it shouldn't be. So what can you do if you accidentally have Lightroom pick the wrong place for a spot? Well, you just saw me. You can drag the location where it's taking the average from, and you can move it somewhere else that has less spots or no spots. Now, if you are working with a really big piece of backscatter, again, you saw me do this. You click on that piece and then you drag your tool, and you can cover multiple pieces of backscatter or a really big piece of backscatter with your tool like that. But I like to be really precise. I don't like to have these really big changes. But sometimes you can actually use that to remove a fish, like this fish right here. So now there's no fish. So there's a lot that you can do. You can, but sometimes it can be also really difficult to remove a fish, or if you want to remove a fish or a big piece of backscatter. And sometimes you do have to use that clone tool. And often I'll mix up my clone tool versus my heal tool, and I'll try to edit photos that way. And the reason I selected this photo right here is because I want to show you guys how I remove a tail of a shark, because I think this photo is great, but I really do think this shark is detracting from the photo, and it's possible to remove. It just takes a little bit of patience, takes a little bit of effort, and it takes that spot removal tool. So let's go ahead and do that now. I'm just going to make a few, actually, I'm not even going to make basic edits. Again, I'm going to go back to that last photo. I'm going to click copy, and I'm going to go to this photo. I'm going to do paste. And it's a little bit blown out, so I'm just going to drop my highlights. And I'll even drop the exposure just a tad. So we want to remove this shark, right? This is a giant piece of backscatter. What you do is you click on the spot removal tool, and I'm going to increase the size of the spot. And then I'm going to drag across and just see what happens. I always just do an initial assessment. What happens when I drag across my spot removal tool to this area? And I want to start with healer, not clone. As you can see, I've created an additional shark. So that's not quite where I want it to go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this area, and then I'm going to go ahead and move it. Now, it's not perfect. Right now, I don't want to go outside the boundaries too much. It's pretty apparent when you do that. But I've removed most of the shark, most of it. You still got these issues right here and right here. You can see this is where I went outside the boundary. But this is a good starting point. So the next thing that I do is I actually take the spot removal tool, and I'll just drag right over my initial assessment. And then I'll try to do that, and then I'll drag this area over. So then I'll drag the area that it's taking the average from, and I'll see if that works. And that works a little better. But one of the things where, one of the ways that the healing tool in your spot removal tool, this heal tool right here, doesn't work is it sometimes makes these weird dark smudges. So the way you get rid of those dark smudges is you can actually go back to your clone tool, and then now you can brush over with your clone tool, and this will do an exact replacement of the colors next to it. And you can see there's this little line where the blue and this kind of brownish color are really apparent. Well, all this clone tool is doing is it's getting me to a starting point. I'm getting to a point where I can replace, some of this weird color that I'm getting, but I know it's not perfect. You're getting these smudges, you're getting these lines. It's not going to look good. But what I do after that is I go back to my heal tool, and then I just heal it back up, because now the heal tool is going to take an average, and it's going to be able to give me a better blue. And that didn't quite work. So I'll zoom back out, go find this heal tool. You have to find the spot that you did it with. Sometimes this can be pretty frustrating. All right, I think, yeah, this was it. All right, so now I've got this. No, this wasn't quite it. Let's see. Here we go. This is the one that I'm looking for. So now I can bring my heal tool back up, and it'll take some time. It takes some effort. It just takes some patience, but I'll just kind of scrape over different parts of the image until it looks natural. And I zoom in and I make sure that it's a pretty even gradient. And you can see there's a pretty even gradient. I got this little spot right here, so I'm going to take that spot out with the heal tool. But overall, that basically removed that tail that I was so focused on. So that's how you remove things. It's not just a single, hey, I'm going to cover this shark and remove it. It's a step-by-step process. And the same goes for if you want to add anything. Again, these are all kind of things that you would do to break a photo contest rule. So don't expect to win a photo contest by adding things into your photo. But let's say I wanted to add the sun. I can remove the sun or I can clone it. And let's swap that out. So I can do a general area. And now I can clone my sun. So now we've got two suns. And again, this is a very rudimentary way of doing things. It's nothing that I normally do, but that's how you clone or take away things. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that second sun. I have a couple questions. What am I clicking on to get into heal mode? So this function right here, if you guys can see my mouse, it says clone and then it says heal. So that's how you go back and forth between cloning and healing. And again, just to reiterate what that means, if I go back to where we were doing backscatter and I go over to this photo and I go to visualize spots, I'm going to reduce the size of this. Cloning will take an exact replica of the spot that it is taking from. And if I undo my visualize spots, you can actually sometimes see that there's a physical spot because it'll be a different color. So if I clone, you don't want to take backscatter out with the cloning tool because it's going to look different. It's going to look like a circle. So to get to your heal tool, you just click heal. And sometimes, you know, if you've accidentally cloned an area, all you have to do is click on the spot like I just did and click heal. So you can go back and forth between clone and heal will take an average and it'll match the colors around it. And that's why that's a much better tool for backscatter removal. But sometimes I just use clone because the colors from the average don't work out. And that's especially true on the outer edges of the image, like with this shark fin that I just took out. So that was on the outer edge of the image, and using the heal tool gave it some weird colors. So that's why I use the clone tool. I have another question. What is the high contrast view you are using called? So that's called visualize spots. So again, the way you get to visualize spots is you click on the spot removal tool, and then you go to the bottom here where this toolbar is, and you click on visualize spots. And this gives you that contrast image where you can see, you know, these are the bubbles from the divers. These are the spot removal or the spots from backscatter. And that's how you really see it. I have another question, which is how much color white balance editing is too much for a contest? So that's a really good question. To be honest, a lot of photo contests out there, they have just given up on editing rules and enforcing them. I actually do a lot of the behind the scenes work for the Ocean Art Underwater Photo Contest. We still keep to our editing rules. Too much is basically where it starts to look unnatural. And I think in a lot of cases, people can tell if it's unnatural or not. In this case, I think I'm right at the cusp. Like if we take a look at this photo right here, I think the blues in this are a little bit unnatural, but they're really nice. And I think most people wouldn't notice that it's really dark and deep. But if I did do a quick comparison to the original photo, that's a pretty decent difference in color, but this would still be acceptable for a photo contest. How do you highlight macro subjects with a black background? That's a really good question. So black background editing. That's a very certain type of, like specific type of editing. I will go ahead and I will do that at the end of this presentation, and I'll actually show you guys how to do black backgrounds. What I recommend not doing is I recommend not using masking tools to get black backgrounds. I highly, highly recommend just starting with your exposure tools And if you want to get a black background, you just darken your shadows, darken your blacks, and you'll get a black background as long as your subject is lit with a strobe. You can fake a black background with a masking tool, and we're getting to masking tools next, but it's not something that I highly recommend doing. All right, let's see if I have any questions on Facebook. All right. Yeah, I have a question saying that I hope this is going to be on your website or YouTube, and this will definitely be on the website and YouTube, and you'll be able to actually view everything on Facebook as well, Facebook Live. So, all right, so we've done our spot removal. Now, this is really basic spot removal, but remember, like I said, you can actually do spot removal at a much higher level. And the way you do that is you use masking tools. Now, masking tools are probably the biggest topic of today. So masking tools are the most effective tools in Lightroom. They're the reason why I think it's important to update Lightroom, but it can also be highly overused to the point where you can see that somebody has used a masking tool. Once you get good at Lightroom, you can pick out those photos that have been too highly edited and don't look natural anymore. But a masking tool can really be the difference of a good photo or not. So they allow you to edit specific parts of the image. So these are non-global changes. And in some photo contests, these types of changes are not condoned. So it's important to know that if you're going to enter a photo contest. But to go to your masking tools, it's this little unassuming circle right here. Now, if you click masking, and then this gives you a bunch of options. So when you click masking, the first thing you want to think about is what aspect of the image do I want to edit? What aspect do I want to select? And in this image, when you click the circle tool, you have a few options. You can select the subject itself, and this is the most effective tool in Lightroom. It's a new tool that basically uses AI to detect where the subject is, and that will allow you to edit the subject specifically, but also everything behind the subject, because you can invert that mask. So it's a very powerful tool. You can select the sky. Again, if you're editing above ground photos, topside photos, then the sky is going to be really useful. It's also useful for water as well. Sometimes it selects water as the sky. A brush tool, I really don't like using brush tools. In the past, before we had these advanced masking tools, a lot of people use brush tools. But the reason I don't like brush tools is because you can see the hard lines where you edit with a brush tool, because then you can see where that mask is applied. Linear gradients are great. They're especially great if you have a horizon. So if you're taking an above water photo. But the way I think about light underwater is I think about it radially. Because if you think about a strobe or you think about the sun, all that light is going through the water in a radial fashion. It's spreading out in a circle. And I use the radial tool most of all. That's not true anymore. Now I use the subject tool, but in the past, I've actually used my radial tool in order to edit things underwater, because light looks radial underwater. So from there, let's talk about, let's try a couple masks. I'm actually going to go back to this photo because I think this photo could really do with a couple of masks. So I'm going to go ahead and select my subject. It's going to take a little bit of time to detect the subject. And it's detected the subject, and it's automatically given me a mask. Now, it already brought the exposure up. So what I want to do is I want to reset this mask. And the way you reset a mask is you go to Effect, and you just double click it. Now everything will reset. You will also know that you have a reset mask because your area will be highlighted. And you can see it did a really great job of finding the shark. Now, I noticed that the shark is just a little bit too blue still. So what I'm going to do first is I'm actually going to decrease the saturation on that shark, and it just pops out just a little more. And the tools in your mask work exactly the same as they do in the rest of Lightroom right down here. You've got your basic exposure correction tools. You have your midtone contrast. You have hues and saturation, and you have sharpness. They're not quite as advanced as the rest of Lightroom, but they're quite advanced and they're quite good. So I think that we can really make the shark pop. So I'm gonna go ahead and increase my shadows. I think that's a good place to start, and my blacks. I'm gonna increase my contrast. I'm gonna increase a little bit of this clarity. And then dehaze, and I'm gonna really just try to make the shark pop. Sometimes it doesn't work though, right? Like that doesn't look very good, so I'm not gonna do my blacks that way. I'm just gonna increase my shadows. And maybe I'll increase the overall exposure of the shark, but decrease the highlights. So I just kind of play around, I go back and forth this way. And I think that's a good look for the shark. I'm just gonna add a little bit of clarity. But what's more important is if I click select a subject again, and it creates a new mask. So I click the plus sign and then select the subject. It found the shark again, but see this top next to select subject, it says invert. This is a really important checkbox. If you click invert, this will move your mask from the shark to the background. And now you can really edit your colors, you can edit your water, you can edit the Snell's window effect that I've got here in the photo. So I'm gonna go ahead, I'm actually gonna create some contrast. I'm gonna increase my highlights just a little bit. I'm gonna deepen my shadows. And I want this water to look really blue. So actually what I'm going to do is I'm gonna go ahead and create a new mask by clicking the plus button. I'm gonna select the sky this time. And now it actually just selected the water because it identified that as blue. And I'm gonna increase the saturation. And one of the things about Backscatter is if I go back to this mask, this is how you edit Backscatter as a whole and look, and remove Backscatter as a whole. You can't really do it with every piece of Backscatter, but you can do it with really small pieces of Backscatter. So just as a reminder, this is where the Backscatter is. Let's go ahead and click Visualize Spots. You can see the Backscatter. There's actually not much anymore because I took some of it out. If you ever want to see more or less Backscatter, you can use this toolbar next to Visualize Spots. So I'm going to increase this toolbar, and I can see a lot of the Backscatter. Now, if I go back to this mask, so I click on the masks, here's my my sky mask. I can actually decrease my clarity just a little bit and increase my noise reduction. And what that allows you to do is it allows you to get a lot of the smaller spots out of the background. And you don't want to overdo it, but now if I go back to visualizing spots, there's actually less here than before the mask. So again, if you ever want to hide a mask, you just click this, you go to your masks by clicking the masking tool. So you bring up your masks, you go to your mask, and then you can hide a mask. And it's a super, super subtle change. But if I hide the mask and I go and I click visualize spots, now I can see, look how much backscatter, how much noise, how much grain is right here. All of this disappears as soon as I put this mask back. And now it's all gone. So you can see that difference. It's a big difference, and it allows you to get a head start on your backscatter. And again, I'm hyper analyzing this image. Normally I would have my visualize spots tool right in the center of this bar, and there's not really much backscatter left here anyway. So let's see where we're at with our masks. Let's see how much of an effect that actually had, because sometimes it's just hard to tell. And actually, I think I want to add a little bit of contrast to just the sky. There we go. That's a little bit more of an effect. So if I took away the masks, now you can see what the photo looks like without the masks. And you can see I really brought out the shark, and I increased that the contrast in the background. And the difference for this photo is huge. I mean, when it's all combined and said and done, you've got a really dramatic shark photo. And it's a photo that I'm pretty decently happy with. So the before and after, now if you go back down to YY down on your bottom toolbar, this is the before and after of this photo. So this is where I would kind of leave this photo and I'd probably be happy with it. I've done my masks, I've edited backscatter out, I've cropped the photo, I've done my exposure adjustments, I've edited the colors, I've done my lens corrections, my detail corrections. I mean, this is the essentials of editing in Lightroom. Like this is everything. And if this was a little fast for you, this is all recorded and it's going to be on the Facebook live on the Underwater Photography Guide, and it's also going to be on our YouTube page, and we're going to have it in our newsletter, so you should be able to find it. Now, there are a few more techniques and tricks that you can do, and again, this is just one style of photo that I've edited, so there's a lot more that you can do here. So let's get back to these photos, and I just want to show you guys a few edits and how I would edit different types of photos so you can get an idea of what that looks like. But before I do that, let's see what questions we have. All right. So if you have more than one subject, can you select a specific subject? Actually, thank you so much, Linda, for reminding me about this. There is one more thing I want to cover with the masking tool, and that is, what do you do if it gets it wrong? So this is a really good example of that. Let's say I want to edit all of the fish in this photo, and I want to select the subject, and I want to select the masking tool. You can see it's got most of the fish, but all this water over here is not quite there, and it's not, you know, where I'd really want it to be. So I can actually click on the mask, and then down here it says add and subtract. So what you can actually do is you can brush in or add different types of shapes onto your current mask. So I'm going to go ahead and click subtract, and I'm going to subtract it with a brush, and then I'm going to decrease the size of the brush. But now I can go ahead and take out the places that it got wrong with the brush. But again, now you're getting into the brushing tool. So now you have a really specific mask. And if I made a major edit with this mask, it wouldn't look very good. It doesn't just cover the fish. So in this case, this is one of these cases where I actually think forget to select the subject on some of the complicated structures. Let's go ahead and copy these edits over. On some of the more complicated images, it's a better idea to do a radio filter. So let's start with a radio filter, because that's how light works underwater. So I'm actually going to work with a radio filter, and you can change your feathering. So what feathering means is basically like how much the edits, or like what is the fall off of the edits as it's being applied. So you can have a complete circle if you bring your feather down to 0, or you can have a lot more fall off. And I usually like to keep mine around 50 with the feather, but a lot of masks, including the brush tool and the linear gradient, they all have feathering tools of some sort. So with the radial gradient, I've increased my feather a little bit, and then I'm going to go ahead and drop my highlights, increase my contrast, drop the highlights again, maybe increase the clarity just a tad, and I'm going to actually try to decrease the saturation just a little bit to try to get these fish to pop out. So that was just a really quick radial edit, but you can already see the difference is pretty big. And that's what I would do for subjects where you really don't have a defined subject, photos where you don't have a defined subject. So here's another radial gradient. So I'm going to go ahead and reshape this radial gradient with the arrows here on the boxes. And then I can increase some contrast, show my shadows. And it seemed a little bit purple, so I'm actually going to move my tint towards green just a little bit, and maybe towards blue, and that should even out the colors. So I'll do really fine adjustments like that with my radio filters, and I think it works really quite well. Let's see what other questions I had here. Is the use of a masking tool prohibited in underwater photo contest? It can be. It can be. It really depends. If a photo contest says that only global edits are allowed in the photo contest, or minimum backscatter removal, then it's likely a masking tool will not be allowed. When you use a background mask to remove backscatter, what adjustments do you make? Yeah, okay, so just to repeat that, if I'm, remember how I use the masking tool to remove backscatter? If I'm doing that, I would go ahead and, let's go back to that mask that we did. I decrease the clarity a little bit. You could decrease the texture just a little bit, and I increase the noise reduction. So it says noise, but this is actually noise reduction. So that's how you get rid of backscatter. You increase the noise reduction, you decrease your clarity. You don't want to overdo it though, and you really want to make sure it's over a negative space. So a negative space is a space like water, where there's not really any texture, not really any detail in the background. You don't want to do that over substrate or rocks. So that's important to know. I've got another question. Do you ever use an iPad to adjust pictures in Lightroom? What about an iPad versus a laptop? So on an iPad and also on a phone, I've actually used them both for Lightroom. They're a little bit more like Creative Cloud, and they don't quite have the same features as the version I'm using, which is Classic, but they have almost every feature, and they're getting really close. So I actually think they're just as effective at editing, and they have all of these masking tools as well. So I have another, oh, no other questions right now. Let's see what other questions I have on Facebook. All right. Yeah, no other questions on Facebook. So let's keep going. So that, like I said, this is kind of where I'm at with all the editing tools, and this is what I would do with most of my editing tools. One thing that I didn't mention is that you can always see your settings that you took from your photo right here. And then if you ever need to flip a photo, you click on the photo, and so I would click on the photo. Just trying to click there. Okay, there we go. Now you can adjust what's in your toolbar right here, but so that's one thing to know, your flags. So this is flagged white, so it's a pick, ratings. And what I'm looking for is the tool that allows you to flip your photo, but I'm not actually seeing it. Maybe that was adjusted in this version of Lightroom. So you go to your photo box right here, and then if you want to flip the photo, you can go rotate left or rotate right. And so that's how you flip your photo. Now, another thing that I left out is what happens if you like an edit that you did, but you want to try two different types of edits. So let's say I want to create a black and white photo from this photo right here. I really like this photo, but I want it to be black and white. One thing that you can do is you can actually right-click on the photo and click Create a Virtual Copy. And what this does is it copies the photo with all the edits that you made, but it doesn't actually create a new photo on that hard drive. So you can make whatever edits you want. The photo is not going to exist in an edited fashion until you export. So if I've created a virtual copy, now I can actually go and I can convert to black and white. So the way you can convert to black and white is actually pretty simple. You go to treatment right here under your basic edits, and you just click black and white. Now, it doesn't do a really good job of converting it to black and white, but it's a good starting point. And one of the things is, this is an edited photo that I turned into black and white. What if instead of using the edited photo, I went back to the original copy and then I reset it? Maybe this would look better in black and white. And I actually think it looks slightly better in black and white. So I can go ahead and crop this. And I'll go back to my original aspect ratio. And now, if I can do all my exposure changes like increasing shadows and blacks and highlights and whites under the basic module. But what's cool about black and white is your HSL tool, that color channel tool, it actually turns into your black and white tool. And now you can edit different color channels as being lighter or darker. So I can go to blue, and the channel that was previously blue can now be made lighter or darker. So now I can kind of edit things where I can create inverted versions of the photo or different versions in black and white. So again, this was all a process that I showed you, but I basically created a virtual copy by right-clicking on the photo, creating a virtual copy, and then I went back to treatment, black and white. And that's how you create a black and white photo. And my computer's just having a little bit of trouble catching up. Let's see if I have any questions about that. Nothing so far. All right, so that's kind of, let me see, I think I talked about copy and pasting. Basically what I do once I'm done with a photo and I like it, I give it a 5-star rating. And what this allows me to do is it allows me to go back into my library. And now I can go to the library to edited photos, go to my grid view by clicking G. If I click attribute, now I can go to my 5 stars. And these are the photos that I've edited. So these are the photos that are done. These are all the ones I want to export. So I can export them now by selecting all of them by clicking Control A or Command A if you're using a Mac, right-clicking on the photos, and then clicking export. And we talked about this in our organization class, so I'm not going to go over export settings. But this is how you would export all the photos that you have finished editing. Now, with that, what I would like to encourage you guys to do is to ask me questions in the chat box or on Facebook about specific tools if you have any specific questions. And I'm actually going to go in and I'm going to edit some difficult photos so you guys can see my workflow, my thought process, and how I edit these difficult photos. And it might give you an idea of what to do in the future. Now, remember, to go back to the photos, you actually have to click the 5-star again in the attribute section. Now you can see all the photos in my edited photos folder. So this whale is a really tough one. And this is one that I really wanted to edit with you guys, because I think it pushes my ability to edit to its limits. And I think it'll be a good way of showing you, okay, you know, this is how you edit the really tough ones. So let's see if I have any other questions on Facebook. Okay, nothing on Facebook quite yet. All right, so let's go ahead and edit this. So I'm going to go into my develop module. Remember, this is the editing module, and this is going to be a quicker edit because I've showed you guys all the tools. Now it's time to implement them, and I'm going to do that. All right, so first thing I want to do is a crop. And the reason I'm doing a crop first is because it's a little bit easier to know what you want to edit when it's just sitting in front of you. Now, it looks to me like I've maxed out my memory again, so I'm just going to go ahead and restart this again. Sorry about that. Oh, this is the photo that we're going to try to edit, so this is good. So now you can see what I'm trying to edit. I'm going to go ahead and open that catalog up again. All right, so let's go ahead and crop this photo. And I want to do the aspect ratio because this is how I like to edit my photos. I like to edit them with the originals. Now, these two whales were near a rock called Roca Partida. And I like the rock. I like the water structure. So there's a difference between me showing you guys what the tools do and how I actually edit. So the way I actually edit is I find what's most annoying to me first, and I just take it out. And I fix it. And that's how I edit. I go through, I look at this photo, I'm like, what annoys me the most? And I fix it. So right now, the thing that annoys me the most is this little spot right over here. So I just want to take that out. So I'm going to do a quick color correction. with this dropper tool, remember. Now, what's nice about whales is they're gray. So they're gray, black, or white. And in this case, they're actually black. But if I do that dropper tool, it already made a big difference. You can already see like the whales pop out. I mean, I already went from blue to not blue, but we like the blue in the water. So we want to try to find a balance. And this photo is all about trying to find a color balance. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to increase my exposure. And what happens when you increase your exposure? Well, if you're already shooting at a relatively high ISO and you increase your exposure, you get a lot of noise. So one of the things that's going to be difficult about this photo is dealing with noise. But before I get into that, I'm going to go ahead and take out some of these spots that just kind of annoy me a little bit. And again, I'm in healing right now, and I'm just doing a quick cursory measure of spots. This one didn't quite get the spot from the right spot. I wanted to get it from the water, so I moved it. I'm just doing a few spots. All right. So now I'm going to go into my exposure tools, and I'm just going to try to figure out how do I get this whale to pop? How do I get some high contrast without losing too much detail? And I'm going to use my clarity, my midtone contrast, and my dehaze quite a bit to try to get it to really pop. And now because I've increased the exposure and I've added clarity, I've got a lot of noise. So this is the next step, because this is what annoys me the most, but it's the most apparent issue. So I'm actually going to go down to my luminance tools under details. I'm going to go ahead and increase that luminance. And you can see that noise just came out like immediately. And let's bring back some of the details into the whale. So I'm going to click Alt, and I'm going to move my masking slider up so that it just selects the whales. Remember, this is Alt on the keyboard. I'm going to increase a little bit of sharpness. But I don't like adding sharpness in Lightroom. I think it looks artificial. I actually like using specialized tools for that. So I'm going to show you guys a specialized tool on that increases the sharpness in this photo. So let's see where we're at. And hopefully this will help you guys see a little bit better what I'm doing. The colors are a little off. They're a little bit purple. And this is one of the rare times that I've had to do this. In this photo, there's a lot of purple in here. So what I need to do, I need to actually move my purples towards blue. And it looks a little bit green, a little bit muddy. So let's move the aquas towards blue and see if that helps. If that doesn't help, let's move the blue a little bit deeper. And I think that kind of worked. You can see the purples have become blue. They become a little bit muddy and dark. So what I might do is I might increase the luminance on the purples, the brightness of the purples a little bit. And then actually I'm going to desaturate them. And I'm just going to saturate the blue channel. And I want to move the blue a little bit towards purple to make it a little deeper, but I just don't want it to become a purple photo. So I'm going to, yeah, like I said, I'll increase the saturation on the blue and maybe increase it a little on the aquas. And then I'm going to go to my luminance, which is the brightness of the color channel. And I'm going to drop the aquas, make it a little bit darker, because the aquas usually stay at the top of the image where the top of the water is. And I wanted that to be a little darker. Now, when I did that, I also noticed this area around this whale got a little dark. So maybe that doesn't work out for me. Oh, maybe not. So that's an okay initial assessment. Now, one tool I forgot to talk about in my basic correction tools is the Vibrance and Saturation tool. And that was a pretty big omission, so I do apologize about that. But the Vibrance tool basically adds colors to the parts of the image that are already colorful. And that's good because your natural tones like skin, like the whales, they stay neutral. Saturation adds color everywhere. And that's a bit too much, and I rarely use saturation. If you look, it makes the whale look saturated as well, but Vibrance makes the blue in the ocean look saturated and not the whale. Now, in this case, that's not true. Because there's so much blue on the whale, the Vibrance tool didn't work out quite as good. So this might be one situation where I'd use saturation. but I think using a little bit of both in this case actually helps. So I brought the colors back a little bit, but I want to bring the whales out even further. They're just still a little dark and they're a little muddy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my masking tools now, and I'm going to select my subject, and I'm going to increase the shadows and the highlights, and then maybe even the exposure on this whale. And after I increase the exposure, I'm going to increase the clarity and the dehaze. I'm going to try to make it pop again. So it's a matter of finding balance between using dehaze and your exposure, because dehaze brings down that exposure again. Now, one thing that I think is interesting is this mask didn't quite get it right. You can see that the fin on the baby whale didn't get selected. So I've actually got to go ahead and go in here and add that part with the brush tool. So I'm going to make that really small, and I'm just going to be really careful to get the mask correct. Ugh, and it did not work out very well. So sometimes it's not, it doesn't work out in your favor. We can try adding a radial gradient as well. But again, it just doesn't fit the shape. That the whale's fluke is a little too dark. So I think in this case, it's a hard one. I'd probably play around with filters for quite a while with this photo. And I also don't like how soft the corner is and how white the surface is. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to add another mask by clicking the mask tool, add the mask, and I'm going to click radial gradient. And now I can drop my highlights, like in the basic correction tools that we talked about, in my whites, and maybe I'll add some saturation and see if I can get it to match a little bit more. And I think that makes it look a little more natural. So, and I might want to desaturate the whales because they're just looking a little bit too blue to me. And that should help them pop out a little bit. Along with the clarity tool. Now I can increase my shadows again and my highlights. So I think that's a good starting point. It's not quite perfect, and you can see that even this subject selection tool, it didn't quite get the whale right here because this whale was a little bit in a dark spot. So you can actually even subtract some of the edges and make it look a little better. So now that it looks a little better now. It doesn't look like that whale has a halo around it. And now I can look at the before and after, and let's see, did I do an okay job? Let's see what I actually ended up with. I think I worked a little bit harder on getting the whale to pop in this one, but I think this is a nice edit also. Now, I spoke about details. You can see it's kind of, there's a little bit of motion blur. The details aren't really quite there. It's maybe not as sharp as I'd want it to be. There's a pretty cool tool called Topaz AI, and it's a standalone program. You do have to buy it, but you only have to buy it once, and it actually integrates with Lightroom. So I would look up Topaz Sharpen AI, and it does a really great job of fixing things like the details on this whale. So I'm going to go ahead and open that from Lightroom. All you have to do is right click on the photo, click Edit in, Topaz Sharpen AI. It also has Denoise AI, Gigapixel AI. And I'm just going to go through this quickly because I know most people or almost all of you won't have it. But it's pretty amazing how things have come when it comes to photo editing. It used to be that people would say, you can't fix focus, you can't fix motion blur, but really now you can. And that all has to do with machine learning and computer programs basically being able to tell based on 1 million photos, how should you correct this photo to get it to correct for motion blur, to get it to correct for being out of focus. And so I'm going to let this analyze. It's analyzing the photo right now. And it's just going to take a quick second. You can see this little bar right here. All right, now you can see that sharpness is really quite fixed. It did a really good job with this photo. And that's all from motion blur and also just having things underexposed. I think the whales look pretty sharp. So I'm going to apply that. And now it's going to actually add an additional TIFF file to my Lightroom. And as it takes, when it's done processing, we'll have a photo that has all those sharpening edits, and it'll be just a little bit better. So that's how I sharpen. I use a program called Topaz Sharpen AI, and I recommend getting it and just reading their instructions on how to use it. So that's my whale photo. But a lot of what I did here was blue water photos. I edited a lot of shark photos, whale photos, things that all have a certain process. So let's try a photo that is more colorful, that has to do more with reef and maybe a close focus wide angle shot. And then I can try to get a macro photo in here as well for anybody who wants to stay on and show you guys how I edit a macro photo or a black background photo. But it'll just take me a second to find that photo. So, oh, I have a question. Oh, yeah, no problem, Gary. The rest of the this presentation will be up. So see you, Gary. And yeah, as people want to drop off, you can leave questions here. I'm just going to keep going because I think giving you guys as much information as possible will help you out in the long run, and you'll be able to see all this stuff as it's going to be on Facebook and on YouTube, so you'll be able to watch again. And you can even slow it down to 75% speed on YouTube. So let's see, this was a photo I like a lot. And I think, got an edit, yeah, this one. All right, this is a perfect photo when it comes to a photo that's a good candidate for Lightroom and fixing things in Lightroom. So let's go ahead and pick this photo. It's now picked. I can even move the photo to edited photos. And now I'm going to go ahead and develop this. This is going to be a really good photo to watch, and this is a really good lesson on color correction. So let's start by doing the most obvious thing here and fixing the white balance in this photo. So if I go to my Lightroom dropper tool, my white balance dropper tool, let's find a white part of the substrate of this photo, because the strobe is a little warm. Isolate strobes tend to be a little warm, but they also make the blue colors turn out a little better because of that. So if you are okay with a little bit of a warmer tint, you can go a long way with a warmer strobe by doing your white balance correction tool. So I'm going to look for a part of this substrate that looks white, gray, or black, and that looks black over there. So I'm going to click the white balance dropper tool, and that did almost nothing. So that didn't work. And I'm just going to look around for a target neutral color. Ideally, it's a place that's lit by a strobe. There we go. That was a nice target neutral. So I think that was a pretty decent neutral color, pretty decent starting point. I'm going to go ahead and drop my highlights and my whites. And then just to see where I'm at. And now I'm going to go back to my white balance. And I'm going to look at my temperature and my tint, because I think these could do a really good job of getting the colors accurate. So if I move my temperature down and my tint maybe a little bit towards magenta, just a little bit, I think the colors start to pop out a tad. And the colors are really nice. They're pretty accurate. Again, all it took was that dropper tool and just a few minor corrections with temperature and tint. But now if I add a little bit of vibrance and make those vibrant colors that are already vibrant, more vibrant, now you start to get some really nice color in this photo. And the difference is already phenomenal. All it took was these basic correction tools here, decreasing your highlights, decreasing your shadows, bring down that exposure, adjust the white balance so that what's actually gray or black looks gray or black, and then increasing the vibrance to bring a little bit of that color back, because you're always going to lose color from a raw file. I do have one question here. Are there any advantages to Photoshop versus Lightroom to edit photos? Yeah, so Lightroom is a great organizational tool. It's a great way to edit photos quickly and to get things out quickly to your clients. It's great for photographers. Photoshop you can do anything with. So it's better for graphic designers and people that want to do anything possible with their photo or with whatever they're designing. So, all right, so back to the photo. I'm just going to do my basic correction tools. I'm going to add a little bit of contrast. And I think the clarity is going to really make this photo pop. Clarity and dehaze. Just a little bit of dehaze, a tiny bit. See how I'm not really bumping these tools? I'm just making minute changes. I'm going to bring the exposure down just a tad. And then maybe the shadows back up to even it out. I do have a lot of backscatter here. I think this might be just a case where I went ahead and sat and I just looked for spots. But I think what I'm going to try to do is I actually want to add a masking tool again. And let's try a radial mask. And I'm going to go ahead and increase the noise reduction and decrease the clarity just a tad. And you can see it already looks a lot better than if I didn't have the mask. It's subtle, but all those small spots are going to be gone. And now I can actually make a few of those adjustments. So I know I'm jumping around a lot, but the reason I'm doing that is because the best workflow possible is to know your tools and then fix what needs to be fixed first. Because you don't always need all your tools. And likewise, you don't need to always use them in that order that I showed you. So I'm doing what I think needs to be done first to really get an idea of how I want this photo to look. And what I'm seeing is I'm seeing a lot of uneven light. So I'm going to go back to that radio filter. I'm adding a radio filter. And I'm going to create a filter over the subject, and I'm just going to drop the highlights. And now I think the light's a little more even. And then I can do, I think I want to go back to my basic corrections and do just an increase in contrast over the whole image. Now, a final step here for me would actually be editing the blues, editing the color in the background, because I think the color in the foreground looks really good. I think we can make the blues look even a little bit better. So all I want to do is go to saturation, increase the saturation of the blues, and then just go to hues and make the blues a little bit more towards purple, like I said before. It makes it look a little deeper. And that's it. That's what I would do with this photo. I mean, I would do a little bit more white balance. I mean, backscatter removal, but I think this is a really good place to start. And that's your before and after. So that's a pretty huge difference. And I think this is a true testament to why you should always shoot in RAW, because you can really only make these color correction changes if you're shooting in RAW. If this was a JPEG file, there's no way that the colors would end up that nice. It would still look just as red and as warm as it did before. But now, because I shot with a warm strobe, I've got a really nice blue color in the back, and all it took was a simple white balance correction to get the colors right. So that's a kind of a cool thing. It really doesn't matter what strobe you use, what light you use. You can always get your colors accurate by doing a proper white balance in post-processing. Let's see if I have any questions on Facebook. All right, nothing on Facebook. So from there, let's get into that macro photo that I promised you guys. I think I don't think I have any other photos that I want to edit right now. Let's see where that whale ended up. Yeah, it's a lot sharper. So if you look at the before and then the after, that's the difference that these tools can really have on a photo. And we can do a reference comparison. So this RA tool allows you to select another photo so that you can compare two photos. So now you can see, oh, I selected the same photo. Yeah. Okay, so now you can see the difference between the before and the after from using Topaz AI. So it's a pretty big difference. All right, so that's the reference tool. Now, I think we'll take a 2-minute break while I look for a macro photo to edit. But any questions, feel free to write them in the chat box, or actually this is also a good time to unmute yourselves if you want to ask any questions without typing it out. Okay, no questions so far. I'm looking for a good photo from Analau, which is a great macro destination. And I think I almost have it. All right, I think I found the photo. It's 3830. Okay, so this is good because now I can import the photo as a reminder on how to import photos. Let's go back to Lightroom. All right, so I'm going to import a photo. So I just clicked File, Import Photo. And now I put this photo in my travel drive under the Lightroom class. Let's see if that photo appears. Yep, gonna uncheck all. All right, so here's a black background photo. Unfortunately, that actually looks like the original was maybe a little bit too black. Let's see. But I think this is a good way to show you guys. So if you're ever trying to get a black background, you generally want to start with a black background, and the best way to do that is through Snoop Photography. So I can show you how I would edit. I'm going to add one more macro photo real quick because I just think this is not quite. It's a little bit just too. Okay, I've got one, I think. 6860. All right, so we're going to do a couple macro photos. So I have one that I took at night, and then I have another that I'm going to turn into a black background photo. So I'm going to go back to my import. Here are the other two. All right, so these are all good examples of macro photos. And I can kind of show you how to cheat and make a fake black background. And this one, I know I did it with it. Did that with this and had the final product as a fake black background. And you can use Lightroom tools to do it. I don't always recommend it, but it can be done. So we're going to edit a couple macro photos, and then I think we can call it a day after that. So if you have any other questions, again, just keep asking me as we go along. All right, so I'm going to go back into my develop module, and I can see that this focus isn't quite perfect here. The focus was right on the Nudibranch. But I'm going to do a quick white balance adjustment. And that looks a little magenta. It looks good. All right, so the best way to get a black background is to just play around with your shadows and your highlights first. Shadows, highlights, and blacks. So usually you want to drop your blacks and you want to drop your shadows so that the background gets dark. But look what happens. Your subject, if it's black, it can also get dark when you drop your shadows and you drop your blacks. So that doesn't always work for creating a black background. So I think this is what people are always trying to get at. You can use masking tools to create a black background. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to go ahead and go to our masking tool right here. And we can select our subject. And let's see if it gets the Nudibranch. It looks like it got the Nudibranch. So I'm going to go ahead and invert. And it looks like it didn't get enough of the Nudibranch. So instead, let's do a radial gradient. Now, this is an old school way of getting a black background, but I think this is one of the best ways. if you put a radial filter, a radial mask over your subject, you can create a more natural black background than if you went and did a brush. And I really think that black backgrounds are they don't look good if you use a brush. It only looks good if you use a snoot, or if you use either a radial or like a subject filter over your subject. So I'm going to go ahead and invert this filter. Remember, you go to radial gradient or whatever your filter is. To the right, it says invert. And now I can go ahead and drop my shadows and drop my blacks and my contrast. And then finally, so when you increase contrast, it decreases exposure. Shadows and blacks obviously decrease exposure. And then my final step here is I'm going to just try to decrease the actual exposure itself. And that's a pretty drastic move. That's why I don't like to do it. Remember, we talked about feather and the effect that feather has on how disperse the effects are in your filter. Well, I'm going to actually increase my feather so that the subject itself is not affected by my exposure changes as much. So that went a long way. And now I've got a pretty decent black background. I'm going to now crop the photo because often you have to crop out substrate or whatever it is. And now I've got a natural looking black background. It's always good to have a little bit of substrate or a little bit of something that makes a black background look natural. So that's one way to do it. Like I said, you want to use a radial filter or a subject mask to actually create a black background like that. And it often helps. I say that, and I started with a black background in a lot of ways. But the reason I started with a black background is I wanted to show you that you really want to start with a black background to create a black background. But if you can't, this is how you do it. If I had the whole image without a black background and I did a radial filter and I dropped my exposure, I dropped my shadows, I dropped my blacks, the image would not look very good. It would look like I had this random spot in the middle of my photo. In this case, sometimes I even like leaving a little bit of substrate, a little bit of texture to make it look more dramatic. And I think in this case, it looks really nice. But if I really hated it, I could also add a radial filter again. I'm going to increase that feather back, and then I can drop my exposure. And now it's gone. So that's a way you can take things out of your photo. So masking tools can be really efficient, but the problem is what you don't want to do. Let's say I've got this horrible photo with tons of backscatter, and it's not quite black and all that. What you don't want to is use a brush tool, and this is what a lot of people like to do. But if I went ahead and I brushed this squid, and I'm not going to do a very good job, but even if I did a good job, you would have some pretty hard lines. So I'm going to brush, well, part of the squid. If I inverted it, I could theoretically create a black background by increasing my contrast, dropping my blacks, dropping my shadows. But you can already see, you can see all the brush marks, and your hand and your mouse is never going to be as good as just having a radial filter with even dispersed light, or now you can actually detect that subject. So again, I might have a photo like this where I do have a black background. I took it at night, but there's a lot of backscatter. The way you get rid of backscatter is you hide it with a lower exposure. So I can select my subject with a mask. Oh, not this guy. So I'm going to select my subject. And if I go ahead and invert this tool, and notice, not everything has been selected properly. So even if I invert this subject, the squid, it might not turn out very good. But the way you can eliminate all that backscatter and really bring that black out is by increasing your contrast, dropping your shadows, dropping your blacks. And now, again, to me, it still looks a little bit artificial because I selected the subject. I didn't use a radial filter. you can see there's really hard lines where the black is. If I was looking at this photo, I would be able to tell that this black is artificial. So the most ideal thing is forgetting all of these filters altogether. If you are in a good starting point and you've got a black background, you can create a black background just by increasing your contrast, dropping your shadows, and dropping your blacks across the image. And it's not perfect. You can see that there is some backscatter, but maybe we can reduce some of this backscatter. So that's where the mask would come in. So let's create a new mask just to reduce the backscatter. So I just created a new mask. I'm going to invert it. And again, I said increase your noise reduction and decrease your clarity. And now a lot of these spots are less apparent. And I might even drop the shadows just a little bit and the blacks just to hide things. So this is a good black background, and the before and after, I mean, I haven't even started editing the squid, but you can see you've got a nice black background, and that's how you really bring the blacks out and do it properly. And I want to one of the things that I kind of liked about this photo is I decided to rotate it. Even though squid it's upside down for a squid, I kind of liked how it looked with the lens down. And so you can do whatever you want with a photo. I'm going to add another gradient here and just bring those highlights down. And now I can add a little bit of vibrance and you're pretty much good to go. So it's not quite done, but that's how I would edit these two kind of macro photos. So yeah. So again, this was just the develop module. What I'm trying to show you guys is how to edit in the develop module. I've got another presentation that shows how to export all these photos. But if I was done with these, I would give them 5 stars. And now if I go back and I go to my Adobe Lightroom presentation and I find all my 5-star photos, everything that I want to export is right here. So to export, I would do Control A, right click, export, and now I can export them all to location all at once, and then the photos exist in real life. So with that, I think that was a good 2 hours. I'm opening up the floor to any questions. Feel free to unmute yourselves, and I'll check Facebook as well just to see where we're at with questions here.